the evening at Baker Street had settled into one of those gentle, unremarkable silences that seemed to belong only to London that night. Outside, the city continued its distant murmur, wheels passing softly over stone, a faint call from somewhere far down the street, the occasional rhythm of footsteps fading into nothing. Inside our rooms at 221B, however, the world felt paused, as though time itself had decided to rest. A small fire burned low in the grate, its glow warm rather than bright, casting slow-moving shadows across the familiar walls. The air carried the faint scent of coal smoke and old paper, a smell that had become comforting through repetition. Everything here had its place, nothing hurried. Sherlock Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, long legs extended, his posture relaxed in a way few people ever saw. A folded newspaper rested loosely in his hands, though I suspected he had finished reading it some time ago. His eyes, half-lidded, reflected the firelight, thoughtful but calm. I sat opposite him, a book open upon my knee, though I confess that I had read the same paragraph more than once without fully absorbing its meaning. There was something about the quiet of the room that encouraged stillness rather than effort. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The clock upon the mantelpiece marked the passing of time with a steady, unhurried rhythm. Each second followed the last without urgency, and in that measured sound there was reassurance. Nothing demanded attention, nothing needed solving. At length, Holmes shifted slightly, the movement no more than a subtle adjustment of comfort. "London," he said at last, his voice low and even, "is at its most honest when it believes itself unobserved." I smiled faintly, accustomed to these quiet reflections. "And what does it confess this evening?" I asked. Holmes glanced toward the window, where the curtains were drawn but not fully closed, allowing a thin line of amber light to escape into the darkness outside. "Routine," he replied. "Order. The comforting illusion that tomorrow will resemble today." He returned his attention to the fire, as though the thought required no further explanation. I closed my book and set it aside, content to simply listen. These moments, when Holmes was neither chasing criminals nor immersed in chemical experiments, were rare, and I had learned to appreciate them. The fire crackled softly somewhere beyond the walls. A carriage passed and was gone. The sound faded so completely that it seemed as though it had never existed at all. Holmes folded his newspaper with deliberate care and placed it upon the table beside him. "I had expected," he said mildly, "that we might enjoy a quiet night." The words had barely left his mouth when there came a sound from below, a measured knock at the door, not sharp, not urgent, merely present. Holmes did not sigh, nor did he appear irritated. If anything, there was the faintest suggestion of amusement in the way his lips curved. "Expectation," he observed, "is so often corrected by experience." Hudson's footsteps could be heard on the stairs, steady and familiar. There was a brief exchange of voices below, soft, polite, and indistinct, before the sound of ascent resumed. Holmes rose unhurriedly and moved toward the armchair nearest the fire, as though preparing himself for a conversation rather than an interruption. He did not straighten his coat or adopt any particular air of alertness. Instead, he appeared almost at ease, as if the arrival of a visitor were simply another natural part of the evening. The door opened, and Mrs. Hudson announced our guest with her usual calm efficiency. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes." "Thank you," Holmes replied. "That will be quite all." She withdrew, leaving the door open as the visitor stepped inside. I noticed him at once, though not because of anything remarkable in his manner. He was of middle height, somewhat stout, with a face that bore the pleasant marks of good nature rather than worry. Yet it was his hair that drew the eye, the vivid shade of red, carefully brushed and unmistakable even in the softened firelight. He removed his hat with polite hesitation, glancing about the room as though unsure whether he had entered a place of business or a private sitting room. Holmes regarded him without staring, his expression attentive but unassuming. "Pray, take a seat," he said gently, indicating the chair nearest the table. "You are quite welcome here." The man did as he was told, settling himself with visible relief. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not in the least," Holmes replied. "We were enjoying the evening." The visitor nodded, clearly reassured by this. "My name is Jabez Wilson," he said after a moment. "I was advised that you might be willing to listen to a matter of curiosity." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Curiosity," he repeated, "is rarely unwelcome." Mr. Wilson clasped his hands together upon his knee. His movements were slow, measured, and entirely devoid of nervous urgency. Whatever had brought him to Baker Street, it did not appear to weigh heavily upon him. "I do not come with a complaint," he said carefully, "nor with an accusation, only a question." Holmes's eyes softened, and his voice remained calm. "Then you have come to precisely the right place." The fire shifted, sending a gentle wave of warmth through the room. Outside, London continued its quiet breathing. And thus, without haste or drama, the evening took its first subtle turn, one that neither rushed nor demanded attention, but merely invited it, patiently and without insistence. Mr. Wilson sat quietly for a few moments, as though arranging his thoughts before allowing them to surface. The firelight played gently across his face, softening its lines, and giving his expression an air of steady composure. He seemed neither anxious nor hurried, and this alone lent the room an added sense of calm. Holmes waited without interruption. It was a quality I had come to recognize in him, that ability to remain utterly still, to grant silence the dignity it deserved. Silence, in his presence, never felt awkward. It simply existed. At last, Mr. Wilson cleared his throat. "I am pawnbroker by trade," he began, his voice measured and even. "My business is modest, but it has served me well enough over the years. I keep regular hours, attend my customers, and return home each evening without much to trouble my thoughts." Holmes inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without comment. "I do not consider myself an unlucky man," Mr. Wilson continued, "nor particularly fortunate one. I have always believed that routine, if followed carefully, has a way of rewarding patience." As he spoke, he reached up almost unconsciously and smoothed his hair, fingers passing through its thick, copper-red strands. The color was striking even now, and I could not help but wonder how often it had drawn attention in quieter moments such as this. Holmes, however, appeared entirely uninterested in the color itself. His gaze remained attentive, focused on the speaker rather than the detail. "I mention these things," Mr. Wilson went on, "so that you may understand I am not prone to imagination. I prefer matters that can be explained, a most sensible preference." Holmes said softly. Encouraged, the man continued. "Some months ago, I engaged a young assistant, a capable fellow, punctual, and eager to be useful. It was he who first brought the matter to my attention, though at the time I thought very little of it." Holmes shifted slightly in his chair, not in anticipation, but in comfort. "And what matter was that?" he asked. Mr. Wilson drew a small breath. "There was an advertisement," he said, "in a newspaper, quite ordinary in appearance, save for one particular detail." He paused, perhaps to ensure he was not being indulged. Holmes remained silent. "It was addressed," Mr. Wilson continued, to men of red hair. I noticed then the faintest change in Holmes's expression, not surprise, but recognition. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, and had I not been watching him closely, I might have missed it entirely. "Go on," Holmes said. Mr. Wilson nodded. The notice spoke of an organization calling itself the Red-Headed League. It offered employment of the simplest sort, for generous pay, and under conditions so mild that they hardly seemed conditions at all. Holmes's fingers rested lightly against the arm of his chair. "And you responded to this notice?" he asked. "I did," Mr. Wilson replied, "at the urging of my assistant, who seemed most enthusiastic about the opportunity. He insisted that such an offer could not be ignored." I observed that Mr. Wilson spoke of his assistant with neither affection nor suspicion, merely as one might speak of a fact long accepted. "The address was nearby," Mr. Wilson went on, "a modest office, unremarkable in every respect. When I arrived, I found that I was not alone." Holmes raised his eyebrows slightly. "There were others?" he asked. "A number of them," Mr. Wilson said, "all red-haired, all respectable, all patient." He smiled faintly at the memory. It was, in its way, a rather pleasant gathering, quiet, orderly, almost ceremonial. Holmes nodded, as though this description confirmed something he had already known. "And the nature of the employment?" he prompted gently. Wilson adjusted himself in his chair. "It was explained to me that my duties would consist of copying passages from an encyclopedia," he said, "nothing more. I was to work for several hours each day, during which time I must not leave the office, nor engage in any other occupation." Holmes's voice remained calm. "And the compensation?" "Most generous," Mr. Wilson replied. "Far more than my usual earnings." The fire crackled softly. I could feel the rhythm of the story settling into the room, not quickening, not slowing, but finding its natural pace. "And you accepted?" Holmes asked. "I did," Mr. Wilson said. "I would have been a fool not to." There was no defensiveness in his tone, only quiet certainty. "For weeks," he continued, "my days passed in the same manner. I arrived at the appointed hour, performed my task, and departed without incident. There was nothing remarkable about the work itself. In fact, its monotony was almost soothing." Holmes smiled faintly. "Routine can be comforting," he said. "Precisely," Mr. Wilson agreed. "I found myself enjoying the regularity of it." As he spoke, the clock upon mantelpiece marked another minute passing, its sound gentle and unwavering. "And yet," Holmes said, "you are here." Mr. Wilson nodded. "Yes," he said quietly, "because one morning, without warning, the office was closed. The League, it seemed, had ceased to exist." Holmes did not react immediately. "And this disappearance," he asked, "troubled you?" "Not at first," Mr. Wilson replied, "but the more I considered it, the more peculiar it seemed. There was no explanation, no notice, only an ending." He spread his hands slightly. "I simply wished to understand." Holmes leaned back in his chair, the firelight reflecting softly in his eyes. "Understanding," he said, "is often the most reasonable desire of all." Outside, sounds of the street had grown quieter still, as though London itself were listening. And in the steady warmth of Baker Street, the mystery, such as it was, continued to unfold, not with urgency or alarm, but with patience, inviting thought rather than demanding it. For a little while after Mr. Wilson finished speaking, the room returned to silence. Not the uneasy kind that presses for response, but the softer sort, one that settles naturally, like dust in a beam of lamplight. Holmes did not move, at once. He remained reclined in his chair, his fingers loosely interlaced, his gaze directed toward the fire, as though the quiet itself were worth observing. Mr. Wilson waited patiently. I noticed that his breathing was slow and even, and that his earlier composure had not deserted him. Whatever curiosity had brought him to Baker Street, it did not disturb his sense of order. This perhaps was what made his account so restful to hear. At length, Holmes spoke. "You mentioned," he said calmly, "that the conditions of your employment were simple." "They were," Mr. Wilson replied at once. "Very clearly stated. There was nothing vague about them." Holmes nodded. "Would you be so kind," he continued, "as to describe them once more? Not as a grievance, but as a routine." Mr. Wilson seemed pleased by the phrasing. "Certainly," he said. "Each morning, 6 days a week, I arrived at the office shortly after 10. The door was opened by a clerk, always the same man, who verified my name and then admitted me without comment. And once inside?" Holmes asked. "I was shown to a small room," Mr. Wilson replied. "Plainly furnished, a desk, a chair, shelves of books, encyclopedias, to be precise. My task was to copy passages by hand, exactly as written." Holmes listened attentively. "There was no supervision," Mr. Wilson continued. "No one watched over my shoulder. The rules were clear, and I followed them." "And those rules," Holmes said gently, "included remaining inside the office for the duration of your work." "Yes," Mr. Wilson said. "That was emphasized." He paused, then added, "It did not trouble me. The hours passed quite pleasantly." Holmes glanced toward the clock upon the mantelpiece. "How long did you remain each day?" he asked. 4 hours, Mr. Wilson replied. "Always the same, never more, never less." Holmes's lips curved into a faint, thoughtful smile. "Consistency," he murmured. Mr. Wilson inclined his head in agreement. "At the conclusion of my work," he went on, "I was paid promptly and allowed to leave. There were no questions, no delays. Everything proceeded with admirable efficiency." Holmes shifted slightly, adjusting his position. "And during this period," he asked, "did you notice anything unusual, any interruption, however small?" Mr. Wilson considered this. "No," he said at last. "Nothing that struck me at the time. The office was quiet. The clerk was polite. The work was peaceful. The fire crackled softly, as though in agreement." Holmes leaned forward just a fraction. "You mentioned that you were not permitted to leave the room," he said. "Did you ever wonder why?" Mr. Wilson smiled faintly. "I assumed it was simply part of the arrangement," he replied. "Rules need not always be explained to be followed." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Indeed." I found myself reflecting on the calmness with which the story unfolded. There was no sense of urgency, no threat implied, only a series of orderly events, arranged with care. "And when," Holmes asked, "did this arrangement come to an end?" Mr. Wilson's expression remained composed. "One morning," he said, "I arrived as usual. The door was closed. Notice had been posted, stating that the League was dissolved." Holmes raised his eyebrows slightly. "No explanation?" "None," Mr. Wilson replied. "Only a brief statement, thanking members for their participation." Holmes reclined once more, the question apparently settled. "And this," he said softly, "is what brings you to us?" "Yes," Mr. Wilson said. "I felt unsettled." He hesitated, then corrected himself. "Not distressed," he added, "merely curious." Holmes regarded him with an expression of mild approval. "Curiosity," he said, "is often the beginning of understanding." A clock chimed softly, marking the hour. Holmes rose and crossed the room with unhurried steps, retrieving his violin from its case. He did not play it. merely held it for a moment, as though weighing a thought. "You have described," he said at last, "a sequence of events, notable not for its excitement, but for its order." Wilson nodded. "That is precisely what struck me," he said. Holmes returned the violin to its place and resumed his seat. "There are," he said, "certain matters that benefit from being examined at leisure." I recognized the tone well. It was the voice Holmes used when no immediate action was required, when contemplation itself was the work. "For now," Holmes continued, "you have done exactly the right thing. You have come not seeking remedy, but clarity." Mr. Wilson appeared relieved. "That was my hope," he said. Outside, the street lay quiet beneath the night sky. The sounds of the city had diminished to a distant whisper, and even that seemed content to fade. Within Baker Street, the warmth of the fire and the steadiness of the clock combined to create a sense of calm continuity. The story, like the evening itself, moved forward without haste, each detail placed carefully, each moment allowed to breathe. And so, with patience and quiet attention, the pieces continued to arrange themselves, not demanding solution, but gently inviting it. Holmes remained seated for some time after Mr. Wilson had finished his account, his attention neither withdrawn nor intense, but resting lightly upon the facts, as though allowing them to settle into place of their own accord. The fire had burned lower now, its movements slower, its warmth more evenly spread. The shadows upon the walls no longer danced, but drifted, rising and falling with a languid grace. The room felt enclosed in a pocket of stillness, untouched by the city beyond. Holmes broke the silence at last. "You have described your experience with admirable clarity," he said. And with restraint, Mr. Wilson inclined his head, receiving the remark without pride. "I have found," Holmes continued, "that unnecessary emphasis often obscures the truth rather than revealing it." He turned his gaze gently toward our visitor. "May I ask," he said, "whether the arrangement interfered in any way with your usual business?" Mr. Wilson considered this carefully. "No," he replied. "In fact, I arranged my affairs so that it complemented my routine. I opened my shop early, attended to my customers, and left it in capable hands for the few hours required." Holmes nodded. "And your assistant?" he asked. "The young man you mentioned earlier." Mr. Wilson smiled faintly. "He was most accommodating," he said, "eager even. He insisted upon managing matters in my absence." Holmes's expression remained neutral, but his attention did not waver. "And this assistant," he asked, "had no objections to the arrangement?" "None whatsoever," Mr. Wilson replied. He seemed positively relieved to take on the responsibility. Holmes leaned back, folding his hands loosely in his lap. "It is often," he remarked, "those who benefit indirectly from a routine who encourage its continuation." Mr. Wilson did not comment, though he appeared to reflect upon the observation. The clock upon the mantelpiece marked another interval of time, its gentle ticking blending seamlessly with the soft crackle of the fire. Holmes spoke again. "Tell me," he said, "during the weeks you attended the office, did you ever deviate from your task?" Mr. Wilson shook his head. "No," he said, "I was instructed not, and I saw no reason to do otherwise." Holmes smiled faintly. "Discipline," he observed, "is a virtue often underestimated." I could see that Holmes was not interrogating our visitor, but guiding him, allowing the details to emerge without pressure. It was a style well suited to the hour and to the man before us. "And the clerk," Holmes continued, "you said he was always the same." "Yes," Mr. Wilson replied, "a quiet fellow, pale, courteous. He spoke little." Holmes raised an eyebrow slightly. "And you never saw him leave his post?" "No," Mr. Wilson said. "Nor did I see anyone else enter." Holmes nodded, as though this too had been expected. "There is," he said, "a particular comfort in environments where nothing appears to change." Mr. Wilson agreed. "It was precisely that," he said. "Each day resembled the last so closely. At time itself seemed to slow." Holmes rose and moved toward the window, parting the curtain just enough to look out upon the street. The night beyond was calm, the lamps casting pools of warm light upon the pavement. There were no crowds, no disturbances, only the quiet persistence of London at rest. He spoke without turning. "You will find," he said, "that most extraordinary arrangements rely upon ordinary habits." Mr. Wilson listened attentively. "When such habits are disrupted," Holmes continued, "the disruption itself becomes noticeable, not because it is alarming, but because it is unfamiliar." He returned to his chair. "The sudden dissolution of your league," he said, "is unsettling not because of loss, but because of absence." Mr. Wilson nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "that is precisely how it felt." Holmes regarded him kindly. "There is no cause for concern," he said, "only for understanding." The words seemed to bring visible relief. Holmes glanced toward me, that I understood that he was preparing to shift the evening toward its next gentle phase, not action, but contemplation. "For now," he said, addressing Wilson once more, "you may rest assured that your experience, while unusual, is not inexplicable." Mr. Wilson exhaled softly. "That is all I wished to hear," he said. Holmes stood, signaling that the conversation was drawing naturally toward its pause. "London," he said, "has a habit of revealing its intentions gradually." Outside, the city lay wrapped in its nocturnal calm. Within Baker Street, the fire burned steadily, the clock continued its patient work, and the night moved forward without urgency. The story, like the hour, did not press onward. It waited, content to unfold in its own time. The evening advanced almost imperceptibly, as though time itself had chosen to move with care. The fire sank lower in the grate, its warmth steady and reassuring, and the ticking of the clock remained the only sound that insisted upon the passing of minutes. Holmes resumed his seat, settling into the armchair with the quiet ease. Mr. Wilson watched him attentively, though without expectation, content to wait for whatever observations might come. "There are," Holmes said at last, "a few small matters I should like to clarify, not because they alter the substance of your account, but because completeness has a calming quality of its own." Mr. Wilson nodded at once. "Ask whatever you wish," he said. "I am in no hurry." Holmes inclined his head in appreciation. "You mentioned," he began, "that the office in which you worked was plainly furnished." "Yes," Mr. Wilson replied, "quite so." "Did it possess," Holmes asked, gently, "any windows?" Mr. Wilson paused to consider. "No," he said, "none that I recall. The light came from lamps placed carefully so as not to cast shadows." Holmes smiled faintly. "And you found this arrangement acceptable?" "Entirely," Mr. Wilson said. "The light was sufficient, and the absence of distraction made the work easier." Holmes leaned back, satisfied. "It is remarkable," he observed, "how often comfort arises from limitation." He allowed a moment of silence to follow, letting the idea settle into the room. "And the books," Holmes continued. "They were always the same." "Yes," Mr. Wilson said, "the same volumes, arranged in the same order." Holmes nodded. "Order," he murmured. I noticed that Holmes's questions were not probing in the manner of an investigation, but exploratory, like a slow walk through familiar ground, noting landmarks without urgency. "And during your time there," Holmes asked, "did you ever feel watched?" Mr. Wilson shook his head. "No," he said, "never." I felt quite alone. Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. There is, he said, a great difference between solitude and isolation. Mr. Wilson smiled faintly. I found it peaceful, he said. The fire gave a soft crackle, punctuating the exchange. Holmes folded his hands once more, and when the lead dissolved, he asked, "You received no further communication?" "None," Mr. Wilson replied. "No letter, no explanation." Holmes nodded, as though this, too, was as expected. "It is often," he said, "the absence of correspondence that speaks most clearly." Mr. Wilson appeared thoughtful, but not troubled. "I suppose," he said, "that I wished to be certain there was nothing more to it." Holmes's voice remained calm and reassuring. "Certainty," he said, "is sometimes found not in answers, but in the knowledge that one has asked the right questions." The clock chimed softly, marking another hour. The sound was gentle, almost apologetic, as though unwilling to intrude upon the quiet. Holmes rose and moved toward the side table, pouring a small measure of tea. The action was deliberate and unhurried, and he offered a cup to Mr. Wilson, who accepted it with a grateful nod. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the steam rising gently from the cups, the warmth spreading through the room. "At present," Holmes said at last, "there is no cause for you to alter your routine." Mr. Wilson looked relieved. "That is good to hear," he said. "Routine," Holmes continued, "has a way of restoring balance, even when curiosity unsettles it briefly." He sipped his tea. "For now," he said, "you may consider the matter at rest." Wilson set his cup aside and rose from his chair. "I am grateful for your time," he said, "and for your patience." Holmes stood as well. "Patience," he replied, "is always well rewarded." They exchanged polite farewells, and Mr. Wilson departed as quietly as he had arrived. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps faded down the stairs, and the door closed with a soft finality. Holmes returned to his chair, the room once more occupied by only the familiar rhythms of fire and clock. I watched him for a moment. "You seem content," I observed. Holmes smiled faintly. "Contentment," he said, "is the natural companion of understanding, especially when one allows it to arrive slowly." Outside, London slept. Inside Baker Street, the night resumed its gentle course, unbroken and unhurried, as the story paused, not concluded, but resting, ready to continue when the hour invited it. The rooms at Baker Street settled once more into their familiar stillness after Mr. Wilson's departure. The fire, now reduced to a steady glow, offered warmth without demand, and the clock continued its patient marking of time. Holmes remained seated, his posture relaxed, his attention apparently at ease. For several minutes, nothing stirred. Then Holmes rose, not abruptly, but as one might when a thought has reached a natural conclusion. "Watson," he said quietly, "I believe a short walk would suit the evening." I did not ask why. Over time, I had learned that Holmes's walks were rarely motivated by urgency. More often, they were occasions for thought to move more freely, unconfined by walls or furniture. I retrieved my coat, and together we descended the stairs and stepped out into the night. London received us with a gentle hush. The street lamps cast their warm halos upon the pavement, and the air carried the faint, clean chill of evening. There were few passers-by, only the occasional figure moving unhurriedly along, absorbed in private reflections. We walked side by side, our footsteps falling into a quiet rhythm. "You are thinking," I observed. Holmes smiled faintly. "I am," he replied, "but not in the manner you might expect." He paused briefly, allowing a carriage to pass, its sound fading quickly into the distance. "This case," he continued, "if one may even call it that, possesses a certain elegance because it lacks drama, I suggested. Precisely, Holmes said. Drama often distracts from structure. We turned a corner, the lamps revealing a narrow street lined with closed shops. Their windows reflected the glow of light, each one a quiet mirror of the night. Mr. Wilson, Holmes went on, is man of habit. His experience appealed to him because it preserved order. And yet, I said, he was unsettled. Holmes nodded. Because the order ended, he said, without explanation. We continued walking, neither of us in any hurry to reach a destination. Do you suppose, I asked, that there is something harmful in the arrangement he described? Holmes considered this. Harm, he said, does not always announce itself, but neither does it always hide. He gestured lightly toward the quiet street. Consider how peaceful this appears, he said, and yet beneath it, life continues, structured, purposeful, unseen. The metaphor required no elaboration. We walked on, passing through streets that grew gradually quieter still. The sounds of the city softened until they seemed no more than memory. There are, Holmes said, certain arrangements that rely upon trust, such as routine, I offered. Indeed, Holmes replied, routine encourages compliance without resistance. I reflected upon this as we walked. And yet, I said, Mr. Wilson did not resist. No, Holmes agreed, because there was nothing to resist. We paused at the corner of a street where a single lamp illuminated a modest shop front. Its sign was unremarkable, its windows dark. Holmes regarded it briefly. Places like this, he said, rarely attract attention, and that, in itself, is a form of protection. We did not linger. The moment passed naturally, without comment. As we turned back toward Baker Street, the city seemed to exhale. The night felt settled, as though nothing more would be asked of it. Wilson, Holmes said after a time, have you ever noticed how easily the mind accepts repetition? I have, I replied, especially when it brings comfort. Exactly, Holmes said. And when repetition ceases, the absence is felt more keenly than any presence. By the time we returned to our rooms, the fire had dimmed further, and the clock marked the hour with its soft, familiar tone. Holmes removed his coat and resumed his seat, once more at ease. For now, he said, there is nothing to be done. I smiled. There seldom is, I said, at this hour. Holmes's gaze rested upon the fire. Understanding, he said, often arrives quietly. It does not require pursuit. The night settled around us once more, complete and untroubled, as the story continued its gentle unfolding, without urgency, without demand, content to move at the pace of rest itself. Morning arrived at Baker Street without ceremony. The light that filtered through the curtains was pale and diffused, softened by the London haze that seemed to linger even in daylight. The street below was already awake, though its sounds reached us only faintly. Muffled footsteps, the distant roll of wheels, voices carried and then lost. Holmes was awake before I stirred. He sat at the table near the window, a cup of tea cooling beside him, a sheaf of papers spread neatly before his hands. There was nothing hurried in his movements. If he worked, it was with the same measured calm that marked his moments of rest. You were up early, I remarked as I joined him. Early, Holmes replied mildly, is a matter of perspective. He did not look up at once, but traced a finger slowly along the margin of a page, as though reading more than words. I have been thinking, he added. I smiled faintly. I assumed as much. Holmes folded the paper and set it aside. Our visitor yesterday, he said, was precise in his recollection. Yes, I agreed, almost soothingly so. Precision, Holmes said, often accompanies honesty, but it also accompanies habit. He rose and moved toward the window, gazing down at the street. "Tell me, Watson," he continued, "what detail remains most clearly in your mind?" I considered the question. "The regularity," I said at last. "Everything happened its same way, every day." Holmes nodded. "Exactly." He turned back to me. "And yet," he said, "regularity is rarely accidental." He poured himself another cup of tea, the steam rising gently. "The office," he continued, "was swindleless, the hours fixed, the task repetitive." "And Mr. Wilson complied willingly," I added. "Because compliance required no effort," Holmes said. "It asked only for patience." He sat again, crossing his long legs comfortably. "There are," he said, "many ways to conceal intention. One of the most effective is monotony." I listened, aware that Holmes was not drawing conclusions so much as arranging thoughts. "And the assistant?" I asked. "The young man who encouraged him." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, yes," he said. "The assistant." He paused, allowing the name to rest unspoken. "Enthusiasm," Holmes said, "is often more revealing than reluctance." The clock marked the passing of another minute. Holmes reached for his violin, drew the bow once lightly across the strings, and then set it aside again. The single note lingered briefly in the air before dissolving into silence. "I find," he said, "that some ideas require sound, even briefly, before they settle." I made no reply. "Mr. Wilson," Holmes continued, "was not chosen at random." I raised an eyebrow. "No?" "No," Holmes said. "He was selected because he would not question the arrangement, because routine suited him, and because of his hair," I suggested. Holmes inclined his head. "That was the qualification," he said, "but not the purpose." The light in the room shifted subtly as a cloud passed outside, dimming and then restoring the brightness. "There is," Holmes went on, "a tendency to assume that unusual conditions exist for unusual reasons." "And in this case?" I asked. "In this case," Holmes said, "the conditions were designed to appear harmless." He stood once more, retrieving his coat from the back of the chair. "Shall we walk again?" he asked. I needed no further invitation. The street greeted us with its steady rhythm. Shopkeepers were opening their doors, arranging goods with quiet diligence. The city moved without awareness of observation. We walked slowly, Holmes occasionally pausing, not to inspect, but to notice. "Watson," he said at last, "have you ever observed how easily one overlooks what lies beneath the obvious?" "I have," I replied, "usually in retrospect." Holmes smiled. "Retrospect," he said, "is a patient teacher." We passed a modest shop, its sign faded, its windows unremarkable. Holmes glanced at it briefly, then continued on. "There is no need to hurry," he said. "Time, in matters such as this, is generous." By the time we returned to Baker Street, the morning had settled into its familiar cadence. Holmes removed his coat and resumed his seat, as though the walk had completed a thought rather than begun one. "For now," he said, "we wait." "And if Mr. Wilson returns?" I asked. "Then," Holmes replied, "we shall listen." The fire was rekindled, the kettle set upon it, and the room resumed its quiet occupation. The story advanced not by leaps, but by inches, each one deliberate, each one calm, content to unfold at the pace of thought and no faster. The afternoon drifted in, little distinction from the morning, as though the day had chosen continuity over contrast. Light softened rather than brightened, and the air within Baker Street retained its familiar warmth. Holmes remained absorbed in the quiet occupation, sorting papers, not by urgency, but by preference, while I attended to my own modest tasks. Time passed without announcement. It was Holmes who eventually rose, his movements smooth and unremarkable, as if prompted by an internal clock rather than the one upon the mantelpiece. "Watson," he said gently, "the city is best observed when it believes itself ordinary. I understood at once. We stepped out once more into London, which welcomed us with its habitual restraint. The streets were neither crowded nor empty, simply occupied. People moved with purpose, yet without haste. Though each had agreed upon an unspoken rhythm, Holmes set a leisurely pace. "There are," he said after a few moments, "places that retain impressions, like memories," I suggested. "Precisely," Holmes replied, "though they do not announce them." We walked along a familiar route, turning occasionally without apparent reason. Holmes did not consult notes or glance about with investigative intensity. Instead, his attention rested lightly upon the surroundings, as one might listen to a piece of music already known. We passed shop fronts, doorways, narrow alleys that opened and closed upon themselves. Each seemed content in its anonymity. "Watson," Holmes said, "what strikes you about these streets?" "That they are unremarkable," I replied. Holmes smiled. "And therefore ideal." He paused briefly near a row of modest buildings, their facades worn smooth by years of quiet use. "Activity," he said, "does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it prefers stillness." We continued on, our footsteps echoing softly against the stone. A cat crossed our path and disappeared between two buildings, its presence brief and unquestioned. Holmes halted at last before a small shop, its windows partially obscured, its sign plain and faded. "There," he said calmly. I regarded the place without immediate recognition. "It seems ordinary enough," I said. Holmes nodded. "Indeed," he replied, "that is its strength." He did not approach the door, nor peer inside. Instead, he observed from a respectful distance, allowing the scene to remain undisturbed. "This," he said, "is a place that benefits from not being noticed." He stood there for a moment, the city flowing gently around us, indifferent to our presence. "There is no need," Holmes added, "to intrude." We turned away, leaving the shop as we had found it, quiet, unassuming, complete in its obscurity. As we walked on, I found myself reflecting upon the ease with which one might pass such a place daily, never suspecting that it held any significance at all. "Holmes," I said, "do you believe me?" Wilson's routine was intended to occupy him. Holmes considered the question. "Yes," he said, "but not merely to occupy." "To distract?" I asked. "To align," Holmes replied. "To synchronize his absence with another's presence." The idea settled slowly, without urgency. "There is," Holmes continued, "but particular elegance in arrangements that require nothing from their participants except compliance." "And he complied willingly," I said. "Because the arrangement respected his habits," Holmes replied. "It asked him to do nothing unfamiliar." The afternoon waned as we returned to Baker Street. The rooms welcomed us back with their steady warmth and familiar scents. Holmes resumed his seat, once more at ease. "For now," he said, "we allow the city to continue its work." "And we wait," I said. Holmes nodded. "Waiting," he said, "is often the most active form of observation." The clock marked another hour, its sound gentle and reassuring. Outside, London continued, remembering quietly, revealing nothing, content to let its secrets rest until they were invited, patiently, to emerge. The evening returned to Baker Street as quietly as it had departed the night before. There was no sharp boundary between day and night, only a gradual softening as though the light itself had grown tired and chosen to rest. The curtains were drawn halfway, allowing the last pale glow of the sky to mingle with the amber warmth of the lamps inside. Holmes sat comfortably near the fire, his posture loose, his thoughts apparently unburdened by urgency. I noticed that he had arranged several small objects upon the table, nothing remarkable, merely items already present in the room. Requisitioned with care. "Ye are arranging," I observed. "Yes," Holmes replied mildly. "Arranging is often a way of thinking." He moved a paperweight slightly, then rested his hand. "Watson," he said, "have you ever noticed how the mind seeks completion?" "In what sense?" I asked. "In patterns," Holmes replied. "When a sequence is interrupted, the interruption draws attention, not because it is alarming, but because it feels unfinished." I nodded, recalling Mr. Wilson's account. "The League ended," I said, "without explanation." "Exactly," Holmes said. "The ending was abrupt, but the arrangement preceding it was careful." The fire shifted, sending a quiet ripple of warmth across the room. "There is," Holmes continued, "a particular comfort in knowing where one must be, and when." "And Mr. Wilson knew," I said. "He did," Holmes agreed. To the minute, Holmes leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, not in fatigue, but in reflection. "Such precision," he said, "is rarely incidental." The clock ticked on, its rhythm steady and unchanging. "When we walked today," Holmes resumed, "we observed places that existed comfortably outside notice." "Yes," I said. "They blended into the street." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And when something blends perfectly, it invites trust." He opened his eyes and regarded the ceiling thoughtfully. "Mr. Wilson's absence," he continued, "was not a loss. It was a space." "A space for what?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "For movement," he said. "For preparation." I allowed the idea to settle without pressing it further. "There is no need," Holmes added gently, "to imagine danger where none has yet appeared." The room felt especially still then, as though the walls themselves were listening. "Watson," Holmes said after a moment, "do you recall the shop we paused before this afternoon?" "I do," I replied. "What was remarkable about it?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Exactly." He rose slowly and crossed the room, adjusting the lamp so that its light fell more softly. "Many arrangements," he said, "depend not upon concealment, but upon expectation." "And expectation," I said, "can be guided." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "routine is one of the gentlest guides." The fire crackled softly, as though in quiet agreement. Holmes returned to his chair and picked up his violin, resting it across his knee. He did not play, but traced the curve of the wood with his fingers, thoughtful. "There is," he said, "a moment in every pattern when its purpose becomes clear, not through effort, but through patience." I watched as he set the violin aside once more. "And we are approaching that moment?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "We are nearing understanding," he said, "which is often indistinguishable from rest." The clock chimed, its tone low and reassuring. Outside, the street had grown quieter. Even the distant sounds of the city seemed to soften, retreating into the background. "For now," Holmes said, "we allow the evening to complete itself." He leaned back, his gaze returning to the fire. "There will be," he added, "time enough for clarity." The room settled into silence once more, not empty, but full of calm continuity. And as the patterns of the day gently aligned themselves into something whole, the night carried on, untroubled, content to let understanding arrive in its own quiet way. Night had settled fully over Baker Street, not abruptly, but with the soft inevitability of something long expected. The lamps within the room cast a mellow glow that did not compete with the darkness beyond the windows, but rather coexisted with it, as though both had agreed upon their boundaries. Holmes sat very still, so still, in fact, that for a time I wondered whether he had drifted into sleep. His eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and measured, his hands resting loosely upon the arms of his chair. The fire had reduced itself to a low, steady presence, no longer dancing, no longer demanding attention. I had learned that this stillness was not idleness, it was listening. The clock continued its patient work, marking time not as something spent, but as something held. Each second followed the last, without insistence, and the quiet between them felt wide and generous. At length, Holmes opened his eyes. "Watson," he said softly, "there is a particular satisfaction in realizing that one need not hurry." I smiled faintly. "You rarely do," I replied. Holmes's lips curved, just slightly. "Hurry," he said, "is most often a substitute for certainty." He shifted in his chair, settling more comfortably. "The arrangement Wilson described," he continued, "was designed to be uninterrupted." "Yes," I said, "until it ended, until it was no longer required." Holmes corrected gently. "I considered this." "You believe," I said, "that its purpose was fulfilled?" Holmes nodded. "Entirely," he replied. The fire gave a soft sound as a fragment of coal shifted and settled into place. "Think of it not as an interruption," Holmes went on, "but as a completion." I remained silent, allowing his words to rest in the room. "There is," Holmes said, "a tendency to view such matters as puzzles demanding solution." "And are they not?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly again. "They are patterns," he said, "and patterns resolve themselves once one stops insisting upon their meaning." He reached for his violin, lifting it with unhurried care. This time he drew the bow gently across the strings, producing a single sustained note, soft, low, and warm. It lingered in the air like a held breath before fading completely. "That," he said, setting the instrument aside, "is often enough." I found myself unexpectedly relaxed, as though the note had settled something within me. "Watson," Holmes continued, "have you noticed how the city grows quieter when night has fully arrived?" "I have," I said, "as though it has said all it needs to say." "Exactly," Holmes replied. "And in that quiet, intention becomes clearer, not louder, merely clearer." He closed his eyes again for a moment. "The absence of explanation," he said, "is sometimes itself the explanation." The clock chimed softly, marking the hour. "There will be," Holmes added, "no sudden revelation this evening. I did not expect one. Understanding," he said, "does not arrive with fanfare. It settles." The word lingered. Settles. Outside, London rested. The streets were no longer pathways of movement, but spaces of pause. Even the distant sounds of the city seemed to have accepted the hour. Holmes opened his eyes once more and looked toward the fire. "I believe," he said quietly, "that everything necessary is already in motion." "And we?" I asked. "We," Holmes replied, "remain exactly where we are meant to be." The room felt complete then, not because anything had been resolved, but because nothing was missing. Holmes leaned back, his posture easy, his expression composed. There was the faintest trace of satisfaction in his features. Not triumph, not excitement, but something far gentler. It was the smile of a man who knew that patience had done its work. The fire continued to glow. The clock continued to mark time, and the night, content with its progress, moved forward without urgency, carrying the story with it, calmly, quietly, and without demand. The night lingered. It did not pass quickly, nor did it press forward. It remained, settled, complete, and unhurried, like a thought that has found a comfortable place to rest. In Baker Street, the lamps burned low, their light softened by shades and distance, and the air carried the familiar stillness that comes only in the small hours. Holmes had not moved for some time. He sat with his eyes closed, not asleep, but resting in that quiet state between attention and release. His breathing was steady, measured, almost indistinguishable from the rhythm of the room itself. The fire had dwindled to low, and the clock continued its patient, unwavering work. I remained awake, though without effort. There are moments when wakefulness does not feel like vigilance, but like floating, supported by silence, unburdened by thought. This was one of those moments. At length, Holmes spoke, his voice low enough that it seemed to emerge from the quiet rather than interrupt it. "Watson," he said, "do you recall how Mr. Wilson described his work?" "Yes," I replied softly, copying, word for word. Holmes nodded slightly, though his eyes remained closed. "Copying," he repeated, "an act that produces nothing new. I considered this. It preserves," I said, "but it does not create." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "It occupies time without altering circumstance." The fire shifted faintly, a small sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the stillness. "Such tasks," Holmes continued, "are often chosen not for their outcome, but for their duration." "For the hours they consume," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "for the certainty of presence elsewhere." He opened his eyes slowly, regarding the ceiling rather than me. "Absence," he said, "can be as carefully arranged as presence." The idea did not trouble me. It settled naturally, like a piece sliding into a space already prepared for it. "And the League?" I asked. Holmes allowed a small pause. "The League," he said, "was a structure, temporary, purpose-built. To end," I suggested. "To conclude," Holmes corrected gently. "Endings imply interruption." This was completion. The clock chimed, its sound round and full, without sharpness. Holmes shifted slightly, adjusting his position in the chair. "There is," he said, "a misconception that schemes rely upon complexity." "And you disagree?" I said. "Entirely," Holmes replied. "The most effective arrangements are simple, repetitive, and agreeable." I thought of Mr. Wilson's calm acceptance, his appreciation of routine. "He was well chosen," I said. "Yes," Holmes agreed. "Not because he was clever or foolish, but because he was consistent." The room felt warmer then, though nothing had changed. "There are moments," Holmes continued, "when understanding arrives not as revelation, but as recognition." He paused, allowing the words to breathe. "One realizes," he said, "that the pieces were always aligned." I leaned back in my chair, listening. "The office," Holmes went on, "the hours, the task, the rule against leaving, none of these were arbitrary. They formed a boundary," I said. "Blabs are furner 4 feet." Predictable. The fire sighed softly, settling further into embers. "And when the boundary was no longer required," Holmes said, "it was removed." "No explanation," I said. "None was needed," Holmes replied. "Explanation invites attention." Silence returned, wide and unbroken. Outside, the city lay in its deepest rest. Even the distant sounds that sometimes drifted through the night had withdrawn, leaving behind only the sense of London itself, vast, quiet, and enduring. Holmes's gaze softened. "There was no urgency now," he said, "no immediate action." I did not ask what action might eventually be required. "In due course," Holmes continued, "the arrangement will reveal itself fully." "And when it does?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "It will do so gently," he said, as all well-designed things do. He reached once more for his violin, not to play, but to hold it lightly, as one might hold a familiar object for reassurance rather than use. "Watson," he said, "do you find the quiet oppressive?" "No," I replied. "I find it complete." Holmes nodded. "Completion," he said, "is often mistaken for emptiness." He set the violin aside. "There will be," he added, "nothing sudden, nothing alarming." The clock marked another passage of time, indistinguishable from the last. Holmes leaned back again, his posture relaxed, his attention at ease. "For now," he said, "we rest within the pattern." The words seemed to settle into the room, becoming part of it. The fire glowed, the clock continued, and the understanding, no longer distant, no longer elusive, took shape not as an answer spoken aloud, but as a calm certainty, present without demand. The night accepted it, and so did we. Morning arrived without insistence. It did not announce itself with brightness or sound, but with a gentle change in the quality of the air. The room at Baker Street seemed to breathe differently, as though the night had loosened its hold just enough to allow the day to pass quietly through. Holmes was awake. He sat near the window, not looking out, but resting in the presence of light, as one might rest in warmth. The curtains were still drawn, yet a soft glow filtered around their edges, blurring the boundary between inside and out. I joined him without speaking. For a while we shared the silence, allowing it to continue uninterrupted. The clock marked the passage of time with its steady, familiar voice, and the city beyond the walls began its slow return to movement. "Watson," Holmes said at last, "have you ever noticed how the most reliable things operate unseen?" "Yes," I replied. "They are noticed only when they fail." Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely," he said. "And when they do not fail, they are forgotten entirely." He rose and moved toward the table, where several papers lay, arranged in quiet order. He did not consult them immediately. Instead, he placed his hand upon the surface, as though acknowledging their presence without requiring their assistance. "The arrangement we have been considering," he continued, "relies upon that principle. Unseen reliability," I said. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "It does not demand secrecy, only normality." He poured tea with unhurried care, the sound of liquid meeting porcelain. "Soft and unremarkable. Consider," he said, "how many people pass beneath the city each day." I paused. "You mean the underground passages?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes said. "Cellars, basements, foundations, the spaces that support what is visible." I pictured the streets we had walked, the shops, the doors, the quiet facades. "They exist," Holmes went on, "without drawing attention to themselves. And because they exist everywhere, they are rarely questioned." He handed me a cup of tea, which I accepted gratefully. "The office Mr. Wilson attended," Holmes said, "was not remarkable for what it contained, but for what it allowed." "Time," I said. "Time," Holmes agreed, "and absence." The word did not feel heavy, it felt precise. "There are arrangements," Holmes continued, "that depend not upon haste, but upon patience." He sipped his tea, and patience, he said, is easiest to maintain when one is comfortable. The room felt particularly still then, as though the idea had settled into place. "Mr. Wilson," Holmes said, "was comfortable." "Yes," I said. "He enjoyed the routine." "And because he enjoyed it," Holmes replied, "he did not resist it." The clock marked another minute. "There is," Holmes said, "a tendency to associate concealment with darkness." "And yet," I said, "everything we have discussed feels open." Holmes smiled faintly. "Because openness is disarming." he said. One does not search for what is not hidden. We sat quietly for a time, allowing the morning to continue its gentle progression. Outside, the sounds of London grew clearer, though still muted. Voices carried, and then dissolved. Carts passed, and were gone. Nothing demanded attention. Holmes stood and retrieved his coat. "I think," he said, "another walk would be beneficial." We stepped out into the street, which greeted us with its habitual restraint. The day had not yet gathered momentum. Shopkeepers moved with deliberation, arranging goods without urgency. The city appeared composed, orderly, and entirely uninterested in observation. Holmes walked slowly, allowing the rhythm of the street to set our pace. "There are," he said, "layers to every city, and we walk upon only one," I said. "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and it is the most obvious." We passed several shops I recognized from earlier walks. None appeared altered. None suggested anything beyond their simple function. Holmes paused briefly near a building with a modest frontage. "Foundations," he said quietly, "are rarely admired." "And yet," I said, "everything depends upon them." Holmes nodded. "Exactly." We did not linger. The moment passed naturally, without the need for inspection. As we continued, Holmes spoke again. "There will come a point," he said, "when what has been arranged above lines perfectly with what lies below." "And then?" I asked. "Then," Holmes replied, "the arrangement concludes." I thought of the League's sudden dissolution. "And it will appear," I said, "as though nothing unusual has occurred." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "that is the intention." We returned to Baker Street as the morning advanced. Holmes removed his coat and resumed his place near the fire, which had been rekindled to a gentle warmth. "For now," he said, "we continue as before." "And if events move?" I asked. "They will do so quietly," Holmes replied, "as all well-prepared things do." The room settled into its familiar stillness once more. The day unfolded. The city continued. And beneath the ordinary surface of routine and habit, arrangements moved toward completion, without haste, without noise, content to remain unnoticed and therefore undisturbed. The day moved forward without emphasis. It neither hurried nor hesitated, but continued in a steady, unremarkable flow, 1 hour easing into the next, each indistinguishable from the last, except in name. At Baker Street, the rooms held their familiar warmth, and the quiet felt earned rather than imposed. Holmes had taken to the armchair nearest the fire, though the fire itself was no longer necessary for warmth. It remained as a presence, not a source, glowing softly, offering reassurance through constancy alone. I sat nearby, reading without urgency, aware that the act itself mattered less than the stillness it preserved. After some time, Holmes spoke. "There is," he said gently, "a particular discipline in waiting." I looked up. "Waiting," I replied, "is often mistaken for inactivity." Holmes nodded. "Because activity," he said, "is usually measured by motion." He adjusted his position slightly, the movement minimal. "But some processes," he continued, "advance most effectively when undisturbed." The clock upon the mantelpiece marked another minute, its sound calm and even. "The arrangement we have considered," Holmes said, "does not require intervention." "And yet," I said, "it requires attention." "Yes," Holmes replied, "but attention of a passive kind." He closed his eyes briefly, not withdrawing from the room, but settling more fully into it. "There are moments," he said, "when to act would be to interfere." I reflected on this. "Mr. Wilson," I said, "would have acted had he felt threatened." "Indeed," Holmes replied. but he felt only curiosity. And curiosity, I said, does not compel. Holmes smiled faintly, precisely. The room felt especially quiet then, as though even the clock softened its voice. Holmes opened his eyes. "Watson," he said, "do you recall how carefully the hours were defined?" "Yes," I replied. 4 hours. No more, no less. And always, Holmes added, the same. The repetition felt soothing even in recollection. Such boundaries, Holmes said, create predictability. And predictability, I said, creates trust. Holmes inclined his head. Trust, he said, is the most efficient companion of patience. We allowed the thought to settle, unchallenged. Outside, the sounds of London continued at a respectful distance. There was movement, certainly, but it seemed to flow around Baker Street rather than through it. The city appeared content to proceed without calling attention to itself. Holmes rose at last, not because anything demanded it, but because the moment had ripened naturally. "I think," he said, "we shall sit with this understanding a while longer." We did not leave the rooms. Instead, we allowed the afternoon to pass through the windows and into evening, the light shifting gradually, almost imperceptibly. Shadows lengthened, softened, and then deepened, tracing familiar paths across the walls. At some point, tea was prepared and consumed without comment. Later, the lamps were lit. Holmes resumed his seat, his posture easy, his expression composed. "There is," he said, "a tendency to expect revelation. And when it does not arrive," I said, "one imagines delay." "Or absence," Holmes replied, "when in truth the process continues unseen." The fire murmured softly. "Consider," Holmes said, "how long roots grow before a tree appears to change." I nodded. "And once visible," he continued, "the change seems sudden." The analogy required no elaboration. Evening settled fully. The street sounds diminished once more, retreating into the background until they were no more than suggestion. Holmes leaned back, his gaze resting upon the fire. "We are nearing," he said quietly, "the point at which patience is rewarded." "And how will we know?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "We will not," he said, "not immediately." He allowed the words to linger. "But we will feel," he added, "that nothing more is required." The clock chimed. The sound did not break the quiet. It completed it. Holmes closed his eyes once more, his breathing slow and steady. "For now," he said, "we remain still, and so will we eat." Wohlstein continued, not as an absence of movement, but as a presence of calm intention. The night accepted it, folding it gently into its quiet rhythm. Nothing pressed forward, nothing receded. The story rested in that space between knowing and doing, content to let time finish what patience had begun. Night returned gently, as though it had never truly left. It slipped back into Baker Street without sound or ceremony, settling into the familiar corners of the rooms, and resting there, patient and complete. The lamps were lighted early, not because darkness demanded it, but because the habit itself felt natural, an old agreement between hour and action. Holmes remained seated near the fire, though the fire offered little heat now. Its presence had become symbolic rather than practical, a steady point of reference in a room where nothing felt uncertain. I noticed that Holmes had arranged the objects upon the table once more, not differently, simply deliberately. Each item rested where it seemed most at ease, neither crowded nor isolated. There was no sense of preparation in the arrangement, only completion. "You seem satisfied," I observed quietly. Holmes did not look up at once. "Satisfied," he replied after a moment, "is a word best used sparingly." He adjusted a paperweight by a fraction, then withdrew his hand. "But I am," he continued, "content." The clock marked the hour, its voice low and even. "There are times," Holmes said, "when events do not require guidance, and yet," I said, "they arrive exactly where intended." Holmes nodded. "Yes," he said, "because they have been moving there all along." The room felt especially still then, as though the air itself had settled into alignment. Holmes leaned back slightly, resting his hands upon the arms of the chair. "The arrangement," he said, "has reached its finest shape." I did not ask him to clarify. The words carried no urgency, no anticipation, only recognition. "There is," Holmes continued, "misconception. Conclusions must announce themselves." "And you believe otherwise?" I said. "I do," Holmes replied. "True conclusions are quiet. They simply arrive." The fire made a small sound as a fragment of ember shifted and found rest. Holmes's gaze softened. "All the necessary movements," he said, "have occurred." "And now?" I asked. "And now," Holmes replied, "there is nothing left to add." We sat without speaking for some time, the silence uninterrupted and complete. Outside, London rested fully. The occasional sound, distant, indistinct, passed through the night without insisting upon notice. The city seemed to have reached the same understanding as the room, that nothing further was required. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "You may find," he said, "that clarity does not arrive as a thought." "How then?" I asked softly. "As a feeling," Holmes replied. "A sense that everything has returned to proportion." I reflected upon this and found that it rang true. There was no tension in the room, no expectation, only balance. The clock continued its steady work, untroubled by significance. Holmes opened his eyes once more and looked toward the window, though the curtains remained drawn. "The League," he said quietly, "served its purpose." "And that purpose," I said, "was never meant to last." Holmes smiled faintly. "No," he said, "temporary structures are often the most precise." The word precise lingered. "There is," Holmes added, "a certain elegance in knowing when to end." I thought of Mr. Wilson, of his calm routine, of the way his curiosity had been satisfied, not by explanation, but by acceptance. "He will not be troubled further," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "He will return to his habits, and they will comfort him," I said. "As they always have," Holmes agreed. The room grew quieter still, though nothing had changed. It felt as though the story itself had taken a breath and released it. Holmes reached for his violin, holding it loosely, not as an instrument, but as an object of familiarity. He did not play. He merely rested his hand upon the polished wood, as one might rest a hand upon a trusted surface. "There is," he said, "a moment when action would feel intrusive, and this is that moment," I said. Holmes nodded. "Yes." The lamps cast their soft halos, steady and unwavering. The fire glowed. The clock marked time. Everything remained exactly where it belonged. And in that precise arrangement, so ordinary it escaped notice, the final alignment settled into place, complete without announcement, perfect without display. The night seemed complete, not finished, not concluded, but whole, as though it had reached a point where nothing more could be added without disturbing its balance. In Baker Street, the lamps burned with steady confidence, their light unchanged, unhurried. The room felt settled, as if every object had agreed upon its place and intended to remain there. Holmes remained in his chair, his posture easy, his attention present without focus. There was no sense of anticipation, only calm. After a long while he spoke. "Watson," he said quietly, There are truths that prefer to be held rather than spoken. I did not reply at once. The idea required no response. When spoken, Holmes continued, they risk becoming something else, sharper, louder, more definite than they need to be. The fire murmured softly, as if in assent. And yet, I said at last, you understand what has occurred. Holmes nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Yes, he replied, I understand. He did not elaborate. Understanding, in this moment, did not ask for explanation. It existed as a settled certainty, present, complete, and content to remain unexamined. There was, Holmes said, no moment of discovery. No sudden realization, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. Only recognition. The clock marked another interval, its sound round and gentle. When recognition arrives, Holmes said, it does not interrupt, it joins. I felt the truth of this in the quiet of the room. Mr. Wilson, I said, will never know the full arrangement. Holmes smiled faintly. No, he said, nor does he need to. And those who arranged it, I asked. They, Holmes replied, have already moved on. The words carried no weight, no urgency. They required time, Holmes continued, a boundary of hours, a certainty of absence. And now, I said, that time has passed. Yes, Holmes replied, and the boundary has dissolved. The fire shifted, settling into itself. There is, Holmes said, a certain kindness in arrangements that conclude without consequence. I nodded slowly. No alarms, I said, no disruptions. Only continuation, Holmes replied, which is the most generous outcome. We sat with that thought, allowing it to rest. Outside, London remained at ease. The city did not feel watched or studied. It simply existed, layered, patient, enduring. Holmes leaned back further in his chair, his hands resting loosely, his expression calm. You may notice, he said, that the room feels no different. I do, I replied, and yet something has changed. Holmes nodded. Completion, he said, often leaves no trace. The clock chimed softly. It is a common belief, Holmes continued, that truth demands revelation. And you disagree? I said. I do, Holmes replied. Truth demands proportion. He allowed a pause. What Wilbur maintained, he said. Truth remains comfortable. The lamps glowed steadily. The fire breathed warmth without demand. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, not from fatigue, but from contentment. There will be, he said, no further steps, no pursuit, I said. No, Holmes replied. Nothing remains unfinished. I reflected upon Mr. Wilson once more, his orderly habits, his calm curiosity, his acceptance of routine. He will return, I said, to his shop and to his hours, Holmes replied, and to his comfort. And the League, I said. The League, Holmes replied, has already become memory. The word lingered, soft and complete. There is, Holmes added, a quiet elegance in endings that do not announce themselves. Syme smiled faintly. Like sleep, I said. Holmes opened his eyes and returned the smile. Exactly like sleep, he said. The room settled further into stillness. No one moved. No one needed to. The truth, whole, gentle, and untroubled, remained where it belonged, understood, not displayed, present, not imposed. And as the night continued its calm passage, Baker Street held that understanding without strain, allowing it to rest, exactly as it was meant to do. Morning returned to Baker Street as it always did, without announcement, without urgency. Light found its way into the room gradually, touching first the edges of the curtains, then the familiar outlines of furniture, and finally the quiet faces of the walls themselves. Nothing appeared altered, nothing required attention. The day arrived, not as a beginning, but as a continuation. Holmes was awake. He sat in his usual chair, a cup of tea cooling beside him, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested not readiness, but ease. Whatever thoughts had occupied the night had done their work and withdrawn, leaving behind a calm clarity that required no effort to maintain. I joined him, content to share the silence. For a time neither of us spoke. The clock continued its gentle marking of minutes, each one indistinguishable from the last, each one complete in itself. At moments like this, Holmes said quietly, one becomes aware of how little disturbance remains. Yes, I replied. Everything feels returned. Holmes nodded. Returned, he repeated. That is the correct word. Set his cup aside. There is, he continued, a natural order to things. When it is respected, it reasserts itself without force. I reflected upon the past days, the measured conversations, the patient waiting, the gradual alignment. And when it is briefly altered, I asked. Then, Holmes replied, it corrects itself. The room seemed to agree. Outside, the sounds of London resumed their gentle patterns. Doors opened, footsteps passed. The city awakened not with urgency, but with familiarity, as though nothing unusual had occurred, and indeed, for most, nothing had. Holmes stood and stretched lightly, a movement devoid of tension. I expect, he said, that Mr. Wilson has already returned to his customary hours. And his shop, I added. And his comfort, Holmes replied. There was no need to check. The certainty was complete without verification. He will not trouble himself further, Holmes continued. The curiosity that brought him here has already settled. And the matter itself, I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. The matter, he said, has resolved itself. He moved to the window and drew the curtain back, just enough to allow a broader band of light into the room. The street beyond appeared as it always had, orderly, familiar, unconcerned. There is, Holmes said, a particular satisfaction in knowing when not to interfere. Yes, I said, and in allowing things to return to their rhythm. Holmes inclined his head. Rhythm, he said, is often mistaken for repetition. And the difference, I asked. Repetition, Holmes replied, can be imposed. Rhythm cannot. The idea settled comfortably. The fire was rekindled, not because the room was cold, but because the act itself belonged to the hour. Tea was prepared once more. The ordinary rituals resumed, unchanged and unremarkable. Holmes took his seat again, this time nearer the table. There will be, he said, no further developments. No visitors, I said. No explanations, Holmes replied, and no need for either. The clock marked another hour. You may find, Holmes continued, that such endings feel incomplete. But they are not, I said. No, Holmes agreed. They are simply quiet. I thought of how easily the city absorbs such quiet resolutions, how many arrangements conclude each day without notice, without record, without consequence. That, Holmes said, is how order endures. The room felt lighter then, as though the absence of expectation had created space rather than emptiness. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, resting. There is nothing left to hold, he said, nothing left to consider. The day advanced slowly. The sounds outside grew and softened again. Within Baker Street, the familiar balance reasserted itself. Chairs, tables, books, fire, clock, each fulfilling its role without effort. Holmes opened his eyes and looked toward me. "You see," he said, "when matters are allowed to resolve naturally, they leave no residue and no restlessness," I added. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "We returned to our quiet occupations, not because they were necessary, but because they belonged to the hour. Reading, writing, sitting. Time passed without friction. The story, too, seemed to settle, its movement no longer forward, but inward, folding gently back into the stillness from which it had emerged. Order had been restored, not announced, not enforced, simply resumed. The day passed, not in stages, not in events, but as a single continuous presence, like a long breath taken without thought of release. In Baker Street, time no longer felt measured by the clock, though the clock continued its steady work. Instead, the hours were marked by softer signals, the change in light upon the walls, the cooling and reheating of tea, the faint shift in sounds from the street below. Holmes remained at ease. He occupied the room without directing it, as though he had become another of its familiar elements, no more remarkable than the chair in which he sat or the books that lined the shelves. His posture suggested neither waiting nor readiness. It suggested completion. I found myself moving more slowly than usual. There was no reason to hurry, no reason to anticipate interruption. Even thought itself seemed to soften, losing its sharp edges and settling into a gentler rhythm. Holmes spoke occasionally, but never at length. "There are days," he said at one point, "that ask nothing of us." I nodded. "And when nothing is asked," he continued, "nothing is withheld." The words required no response. The afternoon light faded without announcement. The lamps were lighted not because darkness demanded it, but because habit invited it. The glow they cast was steady and familiar, touching objects without altering them. Outside, London continued. Its sounds rose and fell, like distant surf, present but not insistent. Carriages passed. Footsteps echoed and disappeared. Voices drifted upward and then dissolved, leaving behind no trace. Within the rooms, the stillness held. Holmes sat with his eyes half closed, not asleep, but resting in that state where awareness requires no effort. His breathing was slow, unremarkable, entirely in keeping with the room. "You may notice," he said quietly, "that repetition has returned." "Yes," I replied, "but it feels different." Holmes smiled faintly. "Because it is no longer purposeful," he said. "It simply is." We allowed the thought to settle. The fire glowed softly, adding warmth without demand. It neither flared nor dimmed suddenly. It remained. "There is," Holmes said, "a point at which even understanding becomes unnecessary." "And we've reached it," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "We have passed beyond explanation." The clock marked another hour. Its sound faded round and complete, as though each chime closed a circle rather than opened a new one. Holmes rose briefly, not to act, but to adjust the curtain by a small degree. The movement altered the light only slightly, yet the effect was calming, like smoothing a crease that had not truly mattered. He returned to his chair. "Balance," he said, "often reveals itself after effort has ended." The evening deepened. The street sounds softened further, until they seemed no more than memory. London did not disappear. It simply receded, allowing the night to take precedence. Holmes rested his hands loosely in his lap. "You may find," he said, "that nothing feels unfinished." I considered this. "Yes," I replied. "Everything feels settled." Holmes nodded. "Settled things," he said, "do not require attention." The fire made a faint sound, a whisper rather than a crackle, As an ember shifted and found rest, time continued its passage without friction. There were no visitors, no letters, no disturbances, and none were expected. Holmes closed his eyes fully now, not as one who sleeps deeply, but as one who allows the world to continue without supervision. "There is," he said softly, "great comfort in trusting continuity." The room held that comfort easily. I found my own thoughts growing fewer, simpler, less insistent. They arose briefly and then faded, leaving behind a sense of spacious calm. The night progressed. At some point, tea was replaced with water. At another, the fire was tended without comment. The clock continued, everything repeated, not as a cycle to be maintained, but as a rhythm that required no attention. Holmes spoke once more, his voice barely above the quiet. "This," he said, "is what remains when a matter concludes." I listened. "Not silence," he continued, "but ease." The word lingered, gentle and complete. The lamps glowed steadily. The chairs remained where they had always been. The room felt neither empty nor full. It simply was. And in that state, where nothing pressed forward and nothing receded, the hours moved on, smooth and unbroken, carrying the listener not toward an ending, but into a deeper continuation of rest. The story no longer advanced. It rested, and in resting, it allowed sleep to do the same. The night settled fully, and then settled again. It did not deepen so much as widen, becoming a spacious presence that held everything within it: sound, stillness, thought, and the quiet spaces between them. At Baker Street, the rooms seemed to expand slightly, not in size, but in feeling, as though they had relaxed their boundaries. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt complete. Holmes remained where he had been for some time, his posture unchanged, his breathing slow and even. The chair supported him without complaint. The floor held its weight without sound. The walls stood without expectation. Each element performed its quiet duty and then released it. The clock continued. Its ticking no longer felt like measurement. It felt like reassurance, proof that continuity did not require attention to endure. I became aware of my own stillness. It was not effortful. It required no decision. It simply happened, as though the room had invited it, and my body had accepted without question. Holmes spoke softly, his voice low enough that it blended with the room rather than rising above it. "There are nights," he said, "that do not ask to be understood." I did not reply. The idea was already complete. "They do not explain themselves," Holmes continued. "They do not move toward anything." The fire glowed faintly, offering warmth without display. It no longer crackled. It breathed. The lamps cast steady halos, their light unchanged, unhurried. Shadows lay where they had chosen to lie and did not wander. Outside, London existed at a distance so great that it felt almost theoretical. The city was present, certainly, but only as a background assurance that life continued beyond these walls, quietly and without urgency. Holmes closed his eyes again. "You may notice," he said, "that nothing needs to be remembered. Yes, nothing needed to be held, nothing needed to be recalled." The story had loosened its grip, not by ending, but by softening, becoming something closer to atmosphere than narrative. The clock marked another hour. Its sound did not break the silence. It rounded it. I found that my thoughts no longer formed complete shapes. They arose gently, like mist, and dissolved before taking substance. There was no resistance to this, no desire to follow them. Holmes adjusted his breathing slightly, then allowed it to slow again. "There is," he said, "a comfort in realizing that nothing remains unresolved. The words did not insist upon meaning. They rested. The fire shifted minutely, a sound so soft it barely existed. It found new balance and remained there. Time passed, not quickly, not slowly, simply evenly. At some point, I became aware of the weight of the chair beneath me, the warmth of the room, the steadiness of the air. These sensations did not demand attention. They offered it gently and then withdrew. Holmes spoke again after a long while. "When all arrangements conclude," he said, "what remains is familiarity." The word felt warm. Familiarity. The room was familiar. The night was familiar. Even the quiet was familiar. Nothing surprised. Nothing required explanation. The clock continued. The lamps glowed. The fire breathed. The room held. The story, if it could still be called that, no longer moved forward. It rested in place, repeating softly through presence rather than words. I noticed that I could no longer distinguish one moment from the next, and there was comfort in that. Holmes's voice returned once more, barely louder than thought. "Sleep," he said, "does not arrive. It is allowed." The sentence settled into the room and remained there. The walls did not echo it. They absorbed it. Everything slowed, not into stillness, but into a gentle steadiness that required nothing further. The night did not progress. It remained. And in remaining, it carried everything: sound, silence, awareness, without asking anything in return. The night remained, not as something that moved forward, but as something that held, wide, patient, and entirely sufficient. At Baker Street, the rooms felt anchored in that holding, each surface and shadow participating in the same unspoken agreement. Nothing needed to change. The clock continued its steady motion. Tick, pause, tick. The sound was no longer a measure. It was a companion. Holmes rested in his chair, his posture unchanged, his breathing slow and unremarkable. He seemed neither awake nor asleep, but present in a way that required no attention. The room did not respond to him. It simply accepted him. I found that I was no longer tracking time. Moments did not line up as before. They overlapped gently, like waves meeting and passing without collision. The sense of sequence softened. What came before felt the same as what followed. Holmes spoke, his voice barely distinguishable from the quiet. "There are hours," he said, "that repeat themselves, not as events, as feelings." The lamps glowed steadily, their light unchanged. Shadows did not shift. They rested where they had settled, content to remain. The fire breathed warmth without sound. It had reached a balance that required no tending. It neither demanded fuel nor threatened to fade. It existed. Outside, London continued to exist as well, though distantly. The city no longer intruded upon awareness. It was present only as a reassurance, proof that the world went on without asking for participation. The clock marked another hour. Its tone was soft, almost rounded, like a sound designed to complete rather than begin. Holmes did not open his eyes. "Repetition," he said quietly, "is not monotony when it carries comfort." I felt the truth of it without thinking. The chair supported my weight. The floor remained firm. The air remained still. None of these required acknowledgement. They simply did their work. Time passed. Or perhaps it circled. There was no difference. The rhythm of the room became more apparent than any thought. The rhythm of breath. The rhythm of light. The rhythm of quiet sound. Tick, pause, tick. Holmes shifted slightly, not as a change, but as a continuation. The movement was small enough that it seemed to belong to the room rather than to him. "You may notice," he said, "that nothing draws the mind forward," and it was true. There was no pull, No destination, no sense of arrival or departure. The story had released its direction. What remained was presence. The fire made the faintest sound, so small it might have been imagined, and then settled again. I became aware that my thoughts were no longer forming words. They arose as impressions, warmth, weight, stillness, and then dissolved without needing to be completed. Holmes spoke again after a long, gentle stretch of quiet. When continuity is trusted, he said, attention relaxes. Yes, attention no longer felt like something I was doing. It felt like something that had softened into rest. The lamps continued. The clock continued. The room continued. Nothing interrupted. Nothing concluded. The night felt wide enough to hold everything without effort. I noticed that even memory had loosened. Earlier moments no longer felt distinct. They had blended into a single, ongoing presence. Holmes's voice returned, even softer now. The words did not echo. They settled. The sense of separation between 1 minute and the next faded further. The rhythm remained, but the edges dissolved. Tick, pause, tick. The repetition became comforting, precisely because it asked nothing. At some point, the fire's warmth shifted slightly across the room, not because it had changed, but because awareness had softened enough to notice it differently. Holmes remained still. The chair remained. The walls remained. Everything remained. The night did not move toward morning. It simply continued being night. And in that continuation, there was no need to listen closely, no need to follow along. The rhythm carried itself, repeating softly, evenly, endlessly. The story no longer advanced. It looped. And the loop did not trap. It soothed. Held within that rhythm, thought drifted. Sensation softened. Awareness rested lightly, without edge or demand. Nothing was expected. Nothing was required. The night held everything, and it continued to do so. Nothing announced the passing of this hour. It did not arrive or depart. It simply existed, stretching gently in all directions, unmarked by urgency or intention. At Baker Street, the rooms were held within that quiet, neither asleep nor awake, but resting in a state where such distinctions no longer mattered. The clock continued. Tick, pause, tick. Its sound no longer suggested time. It suggested continuity. Holmes remained in his chair, unchanged. His breathing was slow and even, so much a part of the room that it felt as though the walls themselves were breathing. He did not move. He did not need to. Movement had completed its purpose long ago. The fire glowed faintly, its warmth steady, its presence assured. It had found its balance and required nothing further. It neither diminished nor flared. It simply was. The lamps cast their soft circles of light, unchanged and unchanging. Shadows rested where they had settled, comfortable in their stillness. Outside, London existed without intrusion. The city did not sleep, but it no longer asked to be heard. Its distant life moved quietly, respectfully, as though aware that this hour belonged to rest. Holmes spoke once more, his voice so low that it felt less like sound and more like thought. "There is," he said, "nothing left to follow." The words did not move the room. They joined it. "That there is no next step," he continued, "no remaining question." The clock marked another interval. Tick, pause, tick. The sound felt complete. I noticed that even the idea of listening had softened. There was no effort involved in hearing, or arrived and departed on its own, without requiring attention. Holmes remained still. The chair remained. The floor remained. The air remained. Everything held its place without effort. Time did not advance. It rested. Holmes spoke again, after a long, gentle stretch of quiet. When a story reaches this point, he said, it does not end. It settles. The word carried weight, without heaviness. Settles. The room felt settled. The night felt settled. Even thought felt settled, no longer rising, no longer falling, simply present, and then gone. The fire made the faintest sound as an ember shifted and found rest once more. The sound was so soft that it did not interrupt. It completed a silence that had already been whole. I became aware that I could no longer distinguish one sensation from another. Warmth, weight, quiet. They blended into a single, continuous comfort. Holmes did not open his eyes. You may notice, he said, that nothing pulls you forward. And it was true. There was no pull, no direction, no expectation. The story had released all momentum. What remained was presence without purpose. The clock continued. Tick, pause, tick. The repetition did not loop back. It did not progress. It simply continued being itself. At some point, the distinction between the room and the night faded. Baker Street felt less like a place and more like a state, a calm arrangement of warmth, stillness, and quiet awareness. Holmes's voice returned once more, barely audible. This, he said, is the part that remains, not the beginning, not the middle, not the end, the part that remains. The lamps glowed steadily. The fire breathed softly. The clock continued its gentle reassurance. Nothing shifted, nothing concluded. The night did not move toward morning. It rested exactly where it was. And in that resting, there was no need to remember how the story began, or what it contained, or where it was meant to go. Those details had already softened and faded, leaving behind only the feeling of continuity. Breath followed breath. Sound followed silence. Silence followed sound. The rhythm carried itself. Holmes remained. The room remained. The quiet remained. There was no closing thought, no final sentence, no need to wake or to listen. Only the gentle certainty that everything was exactly as it should be and would continue to be, without effort, without interruption, without end. And so, the story did not finish, it rested. And in resting, it allowed sleep to do the same.